Hello, today's Bible study comes from the book of Acts, chapter 23, verses 1 through 11, and reads as follows. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewash wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brother, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there is neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all these things. There was a great uproar, and Paul and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Uh-oh. Go ahead. Well, as we see, Paul is still on his mission, and at this time, he's now holding his defense in front of the Sanhedrin. As you saw, he had been through everybody else. Now he got to go in front of the bigwigs. And you remember the crowd at the temple, they wasn't allowing Paul to finish his message to them because they started acting up again. So Paul was getting this opportunity to go in front of the council. And this was probably a better opportunity. And when he got there, he said to them, "Men and brethren," um, in my mind, Paul was bold when he went there. Paul was not afraid. He was not nervous. He went in front of this group and he addressed them. And he made himself seem like he was at home, like, "You are no better than I am." So he tells them, "I have lived a good conscience. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And this was just Paul addressing them before he started speaking to them. Um, and Paul never puts himself above anybody, so it wasn't to put him above them. He was just comfortable, and he was responding to them with a good conscience. And when he had done wrong, he had done wrong, and had when he done right, he did right. But I don't want you to think that this conscience of his was a way that he cleared himself before the Lord. Um, Although he stood behind in front of them with good conscience, but Paul's actions were of no righteousness of his own. Um, he was justified by what the Lord was going to say or tell him to say in this situation where they thought they were the true court. Paul was there to still, as always, represent the Lord. And he went in there with confidence under his own will, and he was going to talk about God. His true problem was going to be he was going to tell them about who God was, and that was going to be a problem for them. And he tells you that the Lord is the one that judges him. But he says, so he starts speaking, and the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him, strike him on the mouth. Well, keep your hands to yourself. But Paul, Paul's was offended. His good conscience offended this high priest, so he thought have someone accused him of such serious crimes. Because remember the things that he was being accused of. Um, the claim never made Paul clear, but he was offended. So what did he do? He had him slapped on the lips. And remember, Ananias is the high priest here. Um, so with him doing this, Ananias really disrespected Paul, but he actually disrespected the position he held because he was a so-called high priest. So Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me. Now, he said, you sit to judge me according to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. When he said God will strike you whitewash, I would have loved to hear how Paul was going at him because I know he was like, you just hit me. But Paul said you will be hit back. And this strike was out of anger. Paul hadn't done anything, but Paul rebuked him and put some weight on it when he said, hey, God gonna strike you. You struck me, but God is going to strike you. I'm not going to look for the vengeance. I'm going to let the Lord take care of that. And this tone and this speech that Paul said to him, this was justified. And remember, Paul was defenseless. Paul was in chains. And to hit him in the face, wow. I mean, he can't protect himself. And they knew this. And then he says, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And Paul was just saying, you're a hypocrite. You are a hypocrite. You're supposed to be the prime example of the law that Moses gave you. But you command somebody to strike me. And this is truthfully against the spirit and the letter of the law. You know, when you read the word, it tells you if there is a dispute between men, they come to the court, then the judges deal with them and talk to them, may judge them. Then they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And then there's the punishments that goes with these things. But it is not to be struck defenseless. So when Paul said God will strike you, they were prophetic. Paul was telling you, you're going to get it, and not for me. So as they were sitting there and they taking this, Paul knows that I'm protected. I have protection in this situation. My Lord will come, and then you will be taken care of. And Paul didn't give him a date. He didn't give him a time. He didn't express he knew when. He just said, this is going to happen to you. So Paul commanded and spoke prophetically to the high priest. You will be struck. So as you see those who were standing there, Paul said, how dare you insult God's high priest? Well, how was he insulting God's high priest? This wasn't truly God's high priest. Because this outburst was bad. He agreed, Paul did. He agreed that it was wrong to speak evil of the ruler of your people, but that he did not know that the man who commanded the punch was Ananias the high priest. Now, Paul didn't know that this dude was the high priest. How would he know? He hadn't been there and everything else. But Paul also knew that he wasn't the true high priest. Don't fool yourself. And Paul also, eyesight was probably bad at this time, but whatever it may be, Paul knew that this wasn't the true high priest. So in verse 6 it says, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and other Pharisees, he told them who he was. Paul saw who was there, and he kind of figured out which ones were which ones. And the actions of this high priest and the attitudes made it plain to Paul, because they had different beliefs. Although they were gathered together as a group, they had different thoughts on their belief system. So Paul gave up on them and stopped preaching the gospel and started talking to this group that really, truly wanted to kill him. One part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees. So Paul probably had said, hey, let you recognize who I am. So even if you, Sanhedrin, think that, hey, the Sadducee side is going to get me or the Pharisee side is going to get me, I'm going to tell you who I am. Maybe that'll help me out. Maybe that'll swing some favor my way. But Paul said, then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers. Commonality. And then he says, I am a Pharisee. I am descended from Pharisees. So he's acknowledging to the Sanhedrin that, hey, I know there's some Sadducees on this group, but I know there's some Pharisees on this group too. And maybe it will persuade or bring some people to his side. And he says, I stand on trial of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Paul tells him why he's there. He's there because he stood on the trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Because Paul knew, and Paul's slick, this was going to divide them, because the Sanhedrin may have been the group, but they had a group inside that group. They had a smaller group, and the Sanhedrin had the Sadducees, and they had the Pharisees. And Paul says, I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And when he said this, the dispute broke out between the two groups. And they were divided, something Paul might have been working on. But Paul knew this because, as he said, he was a Pharisee. And the Sadducees, they didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. But the Pharisees, who Paul claimed to be, they believe in all of this. And this caused a fight, an uproar, a riot. And some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, got up and started going at it with him, because they agreed with him. We find nothing wrong with what this man, they said. And he's a Pharisee, and they believe in what he just said. So they were in agreement with him. And then the question comes up of, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? Well, this really gonna make the Sadducees mad, because they don't believe in him. So more division comes. But for the Pharisees and Paul, it brings them together. The Pharisees are still believing. The dispute got so bad that the commander was afraid they was going to rip Paul up, rip him apart. So he told the troops, get Paul and take him by force. If you have to, grip him up and take him to the barracks. And the following night, the Lord stood by Paul, because Paul stood up there and he said, "Take courage, Paul. This ain't it, Paul." And he tells him, "As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, I got somewhere else you got to go to do it. So you must also testify in Rome." So Paul was being told, your journey ain't over. You ain't done testifying. They might take it the same way, but you're going to go do this in Rome also by the Lord. Amen.